Hi, this is Mary Merriman, and I am interviewing Alanna Berger and Blaise Liffick for the Lesbian and Gay History Project. And Alanna and Blaise are involved with the Silent Witness of Central PA project. I'm going to start with the interview with Alanna, and just ask for just some basic information: your name, date of birth, who your parents were, all that kind of thing that situates you as to where we are.
Okay. My name is Alanna Berger. I was born July 20th, 1954, to Ruth and Louis Berger. My father was from the Bronx in New York, and my mother was from Hummelstown, Pennsylvania. And so when my father came here to visit his brother, he fell in love with my mother, decided to marry her and stay in central Pennsylvania.
Okay. Do you have siblings also as well, Alanna?
I have a sister who was adopted when I was 9 years old, and I have two kids from my previous husband, and they are in their early 30s.
Okay.
And I have two grandchildren.
Okay. All right. And can you talk a little bit about your own educational background, religion, that kind of thing?
Sure. I was raised Jewish, and so living in central Pennsylvania, that meant traveling to Lebanon. My father's family came over from Eastern Europe, and for them education was very important. So from a very early age, I knew I'd be going to college. I ended up at University of Maryland because of its Jewish population, and got a bachelor's degree in philosophy. Unfortunately, that was not a lucrative occupation.
Understood.
And I ended up going back to school at Millersville and getting a degree in computer science after raising the girls.
Okay. So your degree is a master's degree, doctorate?
And both degrees are bachelor's degrees.
Both bachelor's.
Right.
Okay. Right. And how about work? Where are you working at now?
Well, after I got the degree in computer science, I had a job at AMP and then later Tyco. And after 17 years, I decided that I was looking for a change. And so I resigned my position as a systems analyst. And because I wanted to focus more on the work I was doing in the LGBT community, specifically with Silent Witness Peacekeepers.
Okay.
And I was also doing a lot of work with the Freedom to Marry Lay-Led ministry at the Unitarian Church of Harrisburg.
Okay.
And that required, I spent, Blaise was complaining after I quit work, I was spending approximately 60 to 80 hours a week doing volunteer work. So
Wow.
I spent less time at work than I did after I left Tyco. But it was very rewarding work.
Good. Good. And how about religious affiliation?
At this point, I mean, I've always been Jewish.
Okay.
And so I think that's something that has heavily influenced my life. When Blaise and I got married, he was not Jewish, and he offered to convert. But I felt that with raising a blended family, my two kids and his three kids, it would be better to find a common religious home. And so we found that at the Unitarian Church of Harrisburg. So we've been members there for over 20 years.
Okay. All right. And Blaise, talk about your family. Did you grow up here in this region? Or?
No. I'm originally from the state of Indiana. That's where I was born, and then we moved around a bit. Did live some years as a boy in northwestern Pennsylvania in Franklin, in Venango County, and then moved to southern Indiana where I spent my teenage years before going off to college. My parents, Howard and Nina Liffick, lived until the ripe old age of 93 and passed away 4 years ago. I'm one of 6 children, next to last in the list, 2 brothers and 3 sisters. So I grew up in Indiana primarily, Went to college at Purdue in Indiana, where I got my bachelor's degree, and later to the University of Pittsburgh for a master's and Temple University for a doctorate.
Okay. And your doctorate is in what field?
I'm in computer science.
In computer science.
Mhm.
Okay.
And I've been on the faculty at Millersville for 33 years.
Okay. And likewise, religious background?
I grew up Catholic, but once I became an adult, it didn't quite fit me.
Yeah.
And so I sort of didn't do anything for a number of years until I met Alanna, and she told me about the Unitarian Universalism, because her mother apparently had gone to the Unitarian Church of Harrisburg. It seemed to fit with my perspective of the world. So it was a pretty natural thing for us to join, I think.
Okay, good. All right. Okay, one of the thrusts of this interview is to talk about gay and lesbian people growing up in central Pennsylvania and their experiences, but we're also opening that to talk about different organizations that are participating in some way in that nurturing process. I think and Silent Witness is certainly one of those. Is Silent Witness only a local project, or is it a national project, do you know?
No, Silent Witness Peacekeepers Alliance is an organization that Blaise and I formed. It was sort of a natural progression from the Silent Witnesses at the MCCLV Church,
Okay.
which when we talk about how that all came about will become more clear.
Okay.
I think both of us, as we were being raised as children, were, I think we were both raised by very liberal parents. And so, for instance, my father's cousin was gay, and Dad remained friends with him. He was part of the family, and when we'd go to New York, we'd visit him, and we'd go see Bob and Bobby. And then when I went to college in the early 70s at University of Maryland was where I first met gays and lesbians. I worked at the Women's Center, and many of the women were lesbians, and I know at one point I was reading Rita Mae Brown's book, Ruby Fruit Jungle, and I loved it. So I said, oh, we've got to have her speak here. And I just picked up the phone and called her and said, will you come speak at University of Maryland? And she was more than willing to come do that. So that was my experience. Gays and lesbians were my friends. They were no different than any of my other friends. So that was my experience. I did know several of them, when they came out to friends and family, were immediately disowned, which I thought was tragic and unfair. So that was my early experience with gays and lesbians.
Okay. Alanna, just by way of reflection, you knew a number of people who were disowned by their families. Can you put that in a time context?
Sure, that was that would have been 1974, 1975.
Okay.
Was when that first happened, that I watched that, and it was incredibly painful. And it was something where I said, well, you can be part of my family now.
Yeah.
And my parents had no problem with that. So they were, open and affirming, even then, and probably because of my father's cousin.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, but how about you, Blaise?
Well, although my parents were very liberal, I don't recall knowing about the gay or lesbian community at all growing up, other than the use by some of my friends of very derogatory terms. But it wasn't part of my general consciousness until much later in life. In fact, I'd have to say pretty much until I met Alanna. I take that back. I worked with some folks in the late 70s. I was working for Byte magazine, which is a computer magazine up in New Hampshire. And there were some folks in that group who were gay or lesbian. And I mean, it didn't matter to any of us, it seemed. It wasn't even commented on in general. It was just part of who everybody was. And I think, my nonchalance about it probably came from the fact that my parents were so good at being inclusive when I was growing up. I mean, there just wasn't any hint of any racism or anything of that sort that would lead me to think that people who were different were bad in some fashion. So, it just didn't even enter my consciousness, I don't think.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that something about my parents looking for the inherent worth and dignity of every person was something that I found in your parents as well. They would never say a bad word about anybody. So that was something that I think we were both raised with.
That does seem to be, you can almost think sociologically, to a shift in time, because I think my family was raised with some of that as well. But certainly experiences changed over time too. But I do think there maybe was a societal shift about free speech or something that seemed to work into that. I don't know.
Well, certainly in the, us growing up in the 60s with all the issues of racism and feminism that was going on. And while there wasn't a lot in the news at that time, I think in the Midwest at least, about issues related to the LGBT community, certainly, there was no discussion of Stonewall when that happened that I can recall. It still was, I think, part and parcel with the general consciousness raising that was going on related to people being different.
So then, how does that connect with Silent Witness? How did that come about then?
Well, in 2003, Common Roads was going to be showing Jim and Bold, which...
And Common Roads, can you explain that?
Sure. Common Roads is the organization for LGBT youth, and I believe they early on included questioning. So I was familiar with that organization through a woman at the Unitarian Church of Harrisburg whose son was gay. And they were going to be showing the documentary Jim and Bold about the young boy in Lebanon who committed suicide. And ultimately, Fred Phelps' organization heard about that, and they were going to come to Harrisburg to picket. And my friend Sparky Radcliffe called me up and said, "Did you see that article in the newspaper?" And I said, "No," and I looked at it, and then I looked up their website, and I thought, this guy's a lunatic. I mean, who's going to pay attention to him? And the more I read about it, I saw that Susan Wheeler was going to be speaking before the movie. And the thought of having lost a son to suicide, and then having people standing outside saying that my son was burning in hell really upset me as a mother. And so I thought, I really need to get involved. What are we going to do about this? And at the same time, Sparky, I believe her cousin was a member of the MCC Church in Harrisburg, and they had these silent witnesses who surrounded events facing the audience, the community, with signs of support. And so I got in touch with them. They told me that there was this training program that you had to go through to be a silent witness, and they welcomed anybody from our congregation who wanted to participate because they did not have enough people to surround the event. This was being held at the State Museum. And they didn't have enough silent witnesses, so they were happy for additional volunteers. So there were dozens of us from the Unitarian Church who then went through the training in order to do this. And it was a fantastic day. When I talked to Greg King, he said that they were hoping to sell enough tickets to pay for the cost of the movie. They ended up selling out 2 or 3 times. They ended up raising close to $10,000.
Wow.
Our congregation raised about $1,000 just selling T-shirts. And the event itself was amazing. We stood there, we surrounded the community. The Phelps group ended up being in front of the museum, so they were quite a ways off. And I think we got more hugs and kisses that day than I think I'd ever had. There was no violence. There was, it was just wonderful. And because the state of Pennsylvania had treated it like a potential hate crime, they had city police, capitol police, state police, bomb-sniffing dogs, SWAT
Isn't it
teams on the
amazing?
rooftops. I mean, helicopters.
Helicopters, yeah.
It was a crazy day. But I felt as though I had actually done something that was just an amazing gift to a community. And I think it came from my Jewish background, not standing idly by the blood of my neighbor, that I had to stand up and do something. And so that was, I just felt wonderful after doing that. And then the following year, Westboro Baptist Church came back. They were protesting because Lebanon was putting up a monument to Jim Wheeler, and they decided to pick at the Unitarian Church of Harrisburg. So we had all these trained silent witnesses, and we were going to, do the same thing that we had done before. Again, very successful. Nobody got arrested. Everybody felt safe. Attendance at the church was higher than ever that day, and it was wonderful. So the following year, after that, the silent witnesses asked if we would help them, now that we were trained and obviously experienced, would we help them with Pride Festival? And we said sure. So
And it should be pointed out that at that point in time, that group were counter-protesters, right? They were basically protesting against the protesters who were coming to the Pride Festival.
So Silent Witness became a counter-protest.
It originated as a counter-protest group.
counter-protest group, right? Because they were holding signs supporting the community, and so that was a message that was counter to what the protesters had.
Right.
And they remained silent but welcoming to the community, so that the community could focus on these folks instead of paying attention to the protesters. And so we said sure, we would come to Pride Festival. There were about a dozen of us who signed up that day for 1-hour shifts. And when we got there, that was the first year that the street preachers had figured out they did not need to stand in a free speech zone. And so the silent witnesses were standing behind a barricade, as the police had asked us, but the street preachers were just wandering everywhere, getting in people's faces and trying to pick fights. And
there were like 50 of them all over the festival.
A huge number of them.
Huge.
And it felt like suddenly our strategy of holding signs, welcoming the community was not working anymore. And Blaise and I would just drop our signs, jump over the barricade, and try and prevent fights from happening. I think one of the defining moments was when, there were 2 fights about to erupt. There was the mother of a lesbian screaming and crying at a protester, "That's my daughter, and she's perfectly fine," and the lesbian's dragging her mother, "Mom, just leave him alone." And I sent Blaise off to another one where, a straight couple with 3 kids.
Guy was about 6'4", and he had his arm cocked back, ready to deck one of the street preachers.
Right.
And I knew that was the wrong thing to let happen. So I got in between them and almost got decked myself.
Right.
And because it was impossible to make it clear that I wasn't with the street preachers, because I was just dressed in street clothes.
Right.
And the signs that we had were not easily distinguishable in any way. So it made it real clear to me that there was a problem with the process that we were using. But it was the only one we could do that day. Is get in between, try and convince people to go into the festival and leave the street preachers alone.
Right. So we were only supposed to work a 1-hour shift, and we ended up staying until the end of the day because there just were not enough silent witnesses. It was a really hot day. My best friend ended up collapsing from heat stroke. And it was awful. By the end of the day, we were so exhausted, we didn't do the one thing we were told that we needed to do at the end of the day, and that was detox. We just went straight home. And I woke up in the middle of the night with nightmares, sobbing for 2 weeks after that. That was quite possibly one of the worst days of my life. And, I wanted to do something different. We had to fix this. I felt there was something we needed to do to fix this, and I felt that the Unitarian Church of Harrisburg needed to be part of that. And so the following February, we decided that when we saw the call for the Pride Committee, we wanted to be on the Pride Committee. We wanted to help. And we contacted the original Silent Witnesses and said, invited them to a meeting at our congregation. And then serendipitously, 3 other congregations wanted to get involved too. And so we sat down and we had a meeting and we said, what can we do? Blaise had already come up with the idea of having safety vests that clearly identified who we were, because as he said, people coming to the festival couldn't tell us apart from the street preachers without the barricade. And then one of the original Silent Witnesses remembered the angel wings that were used at the Laramie Project, Romaine Patterson's angel wings, and she said, what about that? And I said, well, these are Unitarians. I don't know that they're going to do angels.
Mm-hmm.
But I had brought my umbrella that night because it had rained, and I had it open, and somebody pointed to that and said, what about umbrellas? Those rainbow umbrellas. And we said, let's try it. And so we developed a strategy for using them. Rosemary Morocco got the HomoDepot.com to donate 25 rainbow umbrellas.
Mm-hmm.
And we came up with a strategy on how to use them. We did meet with Harrisburg Park and Recs. We met with the police, to make sure that this was going to be acceptable to them. And they loved it. They said, and here's some more ideas. And so that's pretty much how we started. It was also the first year for the parade.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we marched down, in front of the parade. We had, I forget how many people. I think we had close to 30 people the first year of the parade.
In the parade, yeah. Overall, we had over 100 volunteers that year.
Yeah.
Who were Silent Witness peacekeepers. That was the point at which the organization morphed from being counter-protesters to being active peacekeepers. Mm-hmm. And our sole job at that point became preventing confrontations rather than just standing idly by. Mm-hmm. Not that there was anything wrong with that as the organization began, but that 2005 festival, it became clear that strategy didn't work anymore.
Right.
And so we knew we needed to take an active role rather than something more passive.
Right, because people were still getting arrested, whether it was the street preachers or people driven to some kind of violence, whether it was attacking the street preachers or whatever. And so we trained everybody. Everybody had to go through approximately 2-hour training program where we talked about how they needed to behave, the intentions of the street preachers, who they were, and how to handle an umbrella, because these were big umbrellas, and so we put people through this training, and when we got to the festival that day, by the end of the day, nobody had been arrested. And the police all came down and shook our hands and thanked us.
Oh, they got in line to shake our hands.
They did.
It was truly amazing.
Right. They were incredibly grateful for the work we had done, because a lot of times their hands are tied. They can't do anything until a law is broken. Mm-hmm. And so what we did was we made their job easier by making sure that there were no confrontations. We found out later that the mayor had said if there was one more arrest at a Pride Festival, there would be no more Pride Festivals in Harrisburg. Mm-hmm. And
because it was costing the city too much money.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands of dollars. And so we thought that was just phenomenal. We figured this is what we'd be doing,
Mm-hmm.
One event a year. The following, I think it was January, York Suburban High School was going to put on the Laramie Project. And Fred Phelps was going to come protest this event. And members of the community were excited that the kids in York were going to be doing this. And they wanted to support it, but they were afraid to go, knowing that Westboro Baptist Church was going to be there. And so they said, we'll go if Silent Witness peacekeepers are there. Mm-hmm. And so we said, sure. And it took some effort to get the school district.
The school didn't really want us to go. The police didn't really want us to go. But we said, well, the community, the LGBT community has asked us to be there. And essentially we're going to use our own right of free speech here, and we'll be there. And what ended up happening was that over 100 counter-protesters showed up to protest against Westboro Baptist, and they were starting to get kind of vocal and not very, not quiet, shall we say. And so finally I went to the police chief and I said, look, chief, you got to let us do the job that we've been trained to do and help you keep this crowd quiet. And he finally agreed. And so we, deployed and kept all the confrontations from happening. And afterwards they asked for our help in getting Westboro Baptist Church back to their cars, which were parked on the other side of where the counter-protesters were. So we actually escorted Westboro Baptist back to their cars so that they could get there without being assaulted.
Right, and again, the police
Were really pleased to have us there.
grateful to have us there.
Yeah.
So after that, after that event, then Reading started their Pride Festival. They wanted us there, and at that point, our table was next to Lehigh Valley Pride Festival,
Right.
and they said, "What's this thing with protesters? We've never had protesters." And 2 weeks before their festival, we found out that the street preachers were going to be at their festival, so we called them, and they said, "Please come." And so, and then the following year, Lancaster had their Pride Festival, and Wilkes-Barre started a Pride Festival. They've all asked us to be there. We've had requests for training in various parts of the country. We've gone down to Charlotte, North Carolina, and trained folks down there for their Pride Festival. We've been out to Overland Park, Kansas, trained folks out there. We've been up to Michigan. We've started a group of peacekeepers on college campuses in Pennsylvania. We've counseled various organizations all across the country. They'll contact us when Westboro Baptist Church is coming, or we can see where they've followed our strategies. We'll see pictures. This line of umbrellas protected people getting married in New York. The first day people were allowed to get married in New York, Westboro Baptist Church showed up and they had a line of umbrellas shielding the folks who were standing in line to get married. So I think part of our strategy is respecting the rights of everyone, especially the rights of free speech, the rights to practice religion. We've come to know who the street preachers are, and that's a movement that's growing throughout the United States. Since we've started doing what we're doing, the number of protesters has dropped to almost none. We had one in Lancaster, and he's actually from Harrisburg, but the organizations of street preachers that we've dealt with over the years have stopped coming to central Pennsylvania. I think it's one of those things that, I now teach a class on LGBT issues in America at Lebanon Valley College, and I do a whole section on bullying. And in one of the surveys done, I believe it was at a university in Iowa, 80% of the people who had been bullied said that they wished people would stand up for them. And I think that's what we're doing.
I think so.
We're standing up against the bullies. And as a consequence, they're not getting any traction. And because that's what a bully depends on, they're going somewhere else.
Well, and they're also not drawing a crowd. So when we're not there, the street preachers are pretty adept at getting a big crowd to shout back at them, which they're more than happy to have done. They don't mind people getting angry. It's actually part of their strategy, because it's getting the devil out of people if you do that. So we actually prevent crowds from forming, and as a consequence, they're not getting their message out the way they had before. And so I think they're finding that very frustrating and avoid the places they know we're going to be at this point.
Right.
In the other regions, you had said at Lancaster Pride there was only one person there. What's your expectation for a couple weeks from now in Harrisburg?
I would imagine Steve Garisto will still be there.
The same
He's the
one
same
who was
guy.
at Lancaster, yeah.
Right.
He's been at the Harrisburg Pride Festival essentially every year.
Right.
since we started, and we don't see him going away anytime soon, unfortunately.
No, I think, and he's a known quantity in Harrisburg. As far as I know, there are still 2 restraining orders against him for preaching at school bus stops. And according to one of the judges who
Heard the case.
heard the case, he had crossed the line between free speech and predatory behavior, because he was not just preaching to the kids, but he was following them home, offering them milk and cookies, asking
Wow.
whether their parents were home. And so he's kind of crossed the line. Most of the street preachers that we deal with are, for the most part, very sincere people. I think when you look at somebody like Westboro Baptist Church, that's an anomaly in a different way, in that they are more of a cult. And they have a whole different set of issues. They are a group of people that really need to be ignored, just like you would ignore any other paranoid schizophrenic person screaming at you, or not necessarily ignore, but not engage with.
Right.
But most of the other street preachers, like the folks from Repent America, Life and Liberty Ministries, tend to be very sincere in their fundamentalist view of the Bible. They take a very literal view of the Bible. And most of them are really pretty sincere. And they're the ones who've really stopped coming to protest at the Central Pennsylvania Pride Festivals.
In the other regions, as in Wilkes-Barre and that sort of thing, do you think that, have you had a lot of experience with those groups yet, or is that just something that they're starting?
No. In fact, I'd have to go back to my notes and look, but Lancaster and Allentown have not, and Reading have not had street preachers
For several years.
For several years.
I mean, this is the first year in Lancaster in 4 years, first time in 4 years. Now, Wilkes-Barre, there's a local group up there that had been protesting at the NEPA. It was a local church.
Right.
And they did that for a couple of years, but they didn't
Last
attend
year.
last year.
Starting to lose
So
some energy for it, it seems like.
I think that that's the case, yeah.
Yeah.
And we're just
Well-
hoping that it continues. It's hard to tell.
Yeah, and part of that, I think, was driven by somebody from North Carolina, from Operation Rescue. So the first year they were preaching there, his name's Dante Pavkovich, and they were preaching an anti-abortion, anti-Muslim, and anti-gay message, which sort of took me by surprise, because I'm looking at a gay community thinking they're not interested in anti-abortion. And I think because of his
Insistence, really.
yeah, his presence, that's
Yep.
why they were there. Last year they did not show up. So I think I think street preachers are on one hand diversifying, but they're going elsewhere where they can get a larger crowd. They do like to go places where there are young people and alcohol, because they get a huge response from that group. They are also focusing on anti-abortion. And so they are more likely to be at abortion clinics, or even, medical waste providers, people who take medical waste away from, an abortion clinic. They're trying to shut them down. And so one of the street preachers was actually hanging outside a strip club until 3 o'clock in the morning, and they still go to college campuses quite a bit. I think they get.
That's actually where we see them more frequently now
Right.
than at the Pride festivals. And so I've done a lot of training at the state schools in particular. Since I'm on the faculty at Millersville, it's pretty easy for me to get contacts at the state schools. And so we've trained at, Shippensburg and Kutztown and Slippery Rock, Edinburgh. And that seems to be where we're running into more of the street preachers these days.
Right, and again, they've diversified their message. It's not just anti-gay. It's anti-abortion. It's anti-binge drinking, abstinence before marriage. They're
Anti-evolution.
yeah, they don't want science professors teaching evolution
Yeah.
because the world's only 6,000 years old.
I was thinking about Westboro Baptist, now that Fred Phelps has passed, if that church has dismantled yet, or are they
No,
still
they're still
going
pretty
out, do you
active.
know?
No, Fred's children who have stayed with the organization have been carrying on. Actually, Fred has not been participating in any of the protests. It's the kids. His
He
kids
hasn't
who've
for a
been-
couple of years.
Right. His kids have been carrying on the business. We've talked to Nate Phelps, who's one of his children who escaped from the cult when he was 18, and he firmly believed that that the kids would continue. There might be somewhat of a power struggle because Shirley Phelps Roper, in particular, felt that she should be running the organization, but he said the boys won't let her. So it's now, I believe, 8 of the sons and sons-in-law are now in charge.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It has fractured somewhat over the last dozen years. That some of the Fred Phelps's 13 kids.
No, I think it's at least 16 of his grandkids.
Well, but I mean, he had 13 kids,
Right, and 4
and
of them.
4 of them left, and then about a dozen or so of the grandkids have left. So there has been some fracturing, and there's always a hope that it'll continue to do so, and the power struggle will tear them apart enough that they lose power.
Right.
I think the other thing that a couple of things that come to mind as you're talking is the changes that are going on across many denominations that are beginning to open up to gay and lesbian people, and whether or not for the street preachers, if the balance now is shifted, that they don't have the ability, they don't have the strength as much because they don't have a lot of people at their back. So
I think part of it is that they are feeling more marginalized.
yeah.
And that certainly makes it easier for members of the LGBT community to ignore them. Because, when it seemed like the power was on the side of the street preachers, I think they felt more vulnerable and more oppressed. And now that, for instance, Pennsylvania now allows same-sex marriage, it takes some of the steam out of the vitriol of the street preachers.
And I think even before the same-sex marriage, I think what really helped in central Pennsylvania, for instance, was it wasn't just the Unitarians and the MCC.
Right.
It was, St. Stephen's Episcopal, it was St. Michael's Lutheran,
UCC.
it was the UCC congregations who were open and affirming. And as the community began to see various individual congregations being supportive, even if the denomination wasn't, I think that made them feel less vulnerable.
Yeah.
I think part of the business with the street preachers has to do with the very fundamentalist viewpoint. And I know there was one organization preaching at Millersville condemning brick and mortar church buildings, that's not what Jesus' original message was. And a lot of people are becoming disenfranchised with organized religion. And I mean, the numbers of unchurched people have gone down significantly in the past couple of decades.
No, have increased. Unchurched has increased.
Has increased, right. Right.
Yeah, the number of people who are members of the traditional religions has decreased steadily over the last several
Right.
decades.
Yeah. So I think that helps the community feel less vulnerable because people don't support the street preachers. I think that was what we saw early on, was that, people in the community, people were coming to an event, just blocked out everybody who was Christian. They didn't want to hear it because as far as they were concerned, all Christians were condemning them. And now that, the more liberal folks in mainstream Protestantism have accepted them, I think it's become easier for them to ignore the street preachers.
We've also seen some extensions of silent witness in areas where Fred Phelps was doing the military funerals.
Right.
Yes.
And using their mantra to protesting gay people, but doing a backdoor kind of thing. Have you been involved in any of those kind of events? Have you been called into those?
We were asked, and there is an organization, the Patriot Guard,
Mm-hmm.
the riders, who for the most part were handling that. The hard part for us was that the individual who had passed away was not likely gay.
Mm-hmm.
His family, or her family, was not likely gay. And so we would offer our services if we were asked, but the family really didn't want to have that kind of attention drawn to it. And so our advice when Westboro Baptist Church was coming to protest was, line the street with American flags, surround them with American flags.
If it was a military funeral,
Right.
sure.
If it was, as opposed to rainbow umbrellas. And, and just show sign of support for the family.
We did get involved in an incident in Perry County a couple of years ago where there was the death of 7 children in one family in a fire that Westboro had threatened to attend. And we were drawn into that because members of the community that know us started asking, would we be there to help? And we started looking at Facebook pages that showed thousands of counter protesters were going to show up to try and combat essentially the Westboro Baptist, and that certainly would send things in the direction of riot.
Yeah.
So we actually did investigate that situation. We did a lot of talking with the various groups who said they were going to be there. We tried to counsel them about what's appropriate and what's not.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got in touch with the Sheriff's Department in Perry County and started offering them advice. And while we did not intend to be there as the Silent Witness Peacekeepers, because it had nothing to do with the LGBT community per se, we did manage to help calm the situation down, get the family to issue a request for these counter-protesters to not come. And ultimately that message did get out and was listened to, and everything stayed nice and calm. And so we worked behind the scenes in that particular case and in others like that, where we would help the authorities get a handle on how to deal with the situation.
Right, because one of the things we do when we're asked to participate in an event is, scope it out. And we went up there to Perry County. The town had 1,800 residents.
Mm-hmm.
The streets were backcountry roads, with
No sidewalks.
no sidewalks.
No public space.
And people were, you get all these people, they were going to be busing people in, and, there's no safe place to walk, there's no safe place to park because all the fields were mud, and, it seemed kind of crazy to us.
It would have been
at
total
first.
chaos.
But then because we were also talking to the state police at that point,
yeah.
who are familiar with this, and talking to the state police and the sheriff, we said, well, just have the family tell people, please don't come. And the police said, well, we can't tell people that, it's their right of free speech. And I said, but the family can request it. And so that's what they did. They asked the family to make that public request.
Yeah.
And as soon as the family went on the news and said, we are deeply appreciative of the support, please don't come. This is a private event. The Facebook page is shut down.
Yeah.
Now, there were still people who were likely to go up just because they wanted to be gawkers. But the other thing was, when I was talking to the sheriff and the state police, Westboro Baptist Church does 2 different things. One is they send out faxes to everywhere, threatening to be all kinds of places. But if they're actually going to be there, they will call the police at least 2 or 3 days in advance and ask for protection. Mm-hmm. And so I said, have they done that? And they said, no, they haven't. And so they tried to call Westboro Baptist Church, and the response was, we haven't decided yet. So I said, that's pretty much a guarantee that Westboro Baptist Church is not going to be there.
Yeah.
And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Is they had no plans on being in in central Pennsylvania.
So by mission statement, if you will, do you have one just specifically for silent witness?
Yes, we do.
Which is, and I know we're at toward the end of it, but the branches are going out. So
Right.
how do you stay in your center?
Well, it's very much the case that we were focused on the LGBT community, and that our main purpose was to provide safe and peaceful events for that community. And we made a very conscious decision early on to limit our activities as much as possible to that community because we wanted to stay focused.
Right, we've been asked to, would we provide screeners at abortion clinics?
Yeah.
And we thought about it, and we thought, the LGBT community is not unilaterally pro-choice.
Right.
Necessarily. And so we didn't want to do that. However, when we first did this, one of the first silent witnesses said he had not participated in anything like this since he marched with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so Blaise started doing all this research on nonviolence and Gandhi and King and the principles of Kingian nonviolence. We took workshops in compassionate listening and nonviolent communication. And so many things became, just opened our eyes.
Well, and ultimately were built into our training as well.
Right.
I mean, they became a foundation, a philosophical foundation for the organization. And then we incorporated a lot of that into our training as well. So that it's not just about learning to stand there and not say anything, or even learning to escort somebody, but it actually becomes a very spiritual process for all of us. And it becomes something that transcends the task that we're doing. There's an importance to it that goes beyond the immediate.
Right. So, for instance, I was dealing with one of my legislators and talking about House Bill 300, and I was talking to his assistant, and she said something that just literally put me over the top. And I'm thinking to myself, silent witness training, don't fail me now.
Mm-hmm.
It had nothing to do with the LGBT community. It had to do with my Muslim son-in-law. And I got to thinking, my training came in very handy. Know my opposition, listen to them, find common ground, and, treat that person, as the worthy individual who is likely afraid, doesn't understand what, where I'm coming from. So it wasn't just even our state legislators. At one event, we were asked, can you use these tactics for anything else? And we said, well, I can't imagine why not. What did you have in mind? She said, well, we have an autism conference coming up, and we already know we're going to have protesters. And I said,
Which boggled our mind.
at first.
Yeah.
Right. And I said, well, yeah, know your opposition. Protect their right of free speech.
But it had to
Treat them
do
with respect.
with there being two different philosophies about dealing with autism.
Right.
And those two were in fairly vehement opposition to one another.
Right.
And as a consequence, they sometimes get protesters at them.
Right. So that whole strategy works for, a number of different things. And I see that, when I'm watching, the talking heads on some of the more conservative television shows, and you see them just yelling and they're nasty to each other. And it's like, I think this is what people see, and they think that's the appropriate way that we're supposed to interact. And if we could just sit down and listen to each other, again, sitting with one of my legislators, using the compassionate listening and the nonviolent communication, I said, well, okay, we both agree marriage is important. And we started from that common ground. And then we got to explaining why we thought marriage was important for the LGBT community. And he was talking about his religious convictions. And by the end of the conversation, he said, I could support civil union. I get that. I understand now what you're talking about. And so, this is something that has grown out of the work we've done. And like Blaise has said, it's become a spiritual path for us.
So what's interesting, I think, is that and my symbol is the umbrellas at this point, puts a space between the people yelling at each other.
Yeah.
And says, essentially, you've got to find another way to communicate.
Well, and
This
its symbology was intentional in terms of being protective, and in having there be all this negativity that would bounce off the umbrellas to protect the community. So, you know, although it was very serendipitous in a way that it started, it became very much an important symbol of what we do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think too some of the comments that we've gotten were, you know, people would come up to me and say, you know, we were at an event and I was talking to my partner, and afterwards she said, you know, I didn't see any protesters this year. And she said, well, of course they were there. All I saw were the umbrellas, you know, because of the bright colors. You know, people were focused on those and never even saw the protesters behind us. And it's not like we had this huge impenetrable wall. When we look at pictures of us, there's, you know, 2 to 3 feet between each one of us. And yet people still saw the colors. They saw our smiling faces. You know, we would walk them, you know, how you doing? Are you here? And just engage them in conversation, and they never even saw the protesters. So I think the
That's when we
umbrellas-
knew we did our job right.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we've been at enough Pride festivals where it rained that we were really glad.
Or
we saw
was such bright sun at 90,
Right.
98 degrees that we were thankful
Right.
for the portable shade.
Yeah, yeah, but I think the umbrellas really did their job. I think the other thing too is, you know, later as we started learning more about, you know, hypoarousal and hyperarousal, you know, we invited a mental health crisis intervention nurse to educate us on how to handle people who might have a meltdown. And she was really helpful in terms of, you know, helping us understand when to recognize those symptoms, how to diffuse them. And there's a point in time where, you know, we will put the umbrellas down and hold them across our bodies, and they become, you know, another tool to help keep people calm, because we now feel confident enough to let people have conversations with the street preachers. And
As long as they stay conversations and not
Right.
arguments.
right, and people have walked away from that, and this happened at Lancaster this year. A guy talked to the street preacher and walked away from it saying, you know, he's really sincere in his belief. I don't agree with him, but, you know, he was able to have that conversation and come to his own realization that, you know, the street preacher wasn't somebody evil, but was in fact, you know, just somebody with a different viewpoint. So it's been exciting. I think
It's been an education for us.
people originally asked me, "What's your goal? You know, are you gonna have chapters all over the United States?" And I said, "My goal is to put ourselves out of business." And we are this close to it. So I'm kind of glad to be part of this project, because, you know, I'm thinking it's going to be one of the last times we really get to do something like this. Now we're going to write our book.
Hopefully.
Yeah, and hopefully move on.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Anything that I haven't asked, or anything else you'd like to add to this?
Well, I certainly want to say thank you to the LGBT Center in general
Right.
for the hard work that they've done over the last 10 years or so, becoming a reality, and in supporting us as well,
Right.
and the LGBT community in general. That we've had nothing but acceptance as a couple of old street folks. You know, we feel like we've been accepted by the community, and that feels good to us.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I
They're
when I-
family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I look at, you know, all the people I've met over, you know, these past however many years, 11 years since we've been doing this work, and that very first event, you know, the number of hugs and kisses I got that day, and the gratitude, you know, kind of got me started. But it's my gratitude to be able to give this back. You know, to be able to, you know, look at the way things have changed, if nowhere else, at least central Pennsylvania.
And to make our community safer and,
Right.
and a happier place. I mean, you know, part of what got us started was the thought of not in our backyard. You know, this stuff is not going to happen in our community. Westboro Baptist is not going to come in and stir up hate, and will not stand by and let that happen. And you know, it's been a hard 10 years in this work, or longer, since we became advocates, not only as silent witnesses, but advocating at the state legislature and such. And I thought it would be a lot longer to get to this point where things are starting to mellow out and people are becoming more accepting. And I mean, we have same-sex marriage, you know, available in the state now. I mean, I never thought we'd have that at this point in time. And I know we've contributed to that and have certainly self-satisfaction about that. And but I also know how hard everybody else has worked in making that a reality as well, and making our lives easier as our peacekeepers. You know, at the events, that we've gotten a lot of cooperation from the community in the work that we do as well.
Right.
Well, and I want to thank you too.
Sure.
I was just thinking, I'm also in the process of doing some writing about 10 years before you guys started, and thinking about the people as we were interviewing about how important allies have been, and that means for every community that's marginalized is finding allies to kind of have their backs, if you will, or at least give you a chance to breathe
Right.
and to be safe. And I was thinking back again in the time that I was doing some things that it was some people in the background that were incredibly important. So, and certainly in the foreground as well. So I want to thank you all. It's been just a blessing.
It's been our pleasure.
And that was something, because when we first started doing this, we were also involved in some anti-racism work. And, you know, one of the things we kept hearing was, you know, racism is really white people's work. You know, anti-racism is really white people's work. You know, they caused the problem, they have to solve it. And it was really easy to say, you know what, homophobia is straight people. They caused it.
It's our work.
It's our work. We have to, you know, educate people. And that's been, you know, that's been easier than I expected it to be. But when I still come across people who just astound me. We were talking to one of our legislators' aides, and he said, okay, so you've got this continuum with bestiality on one end and Amish dominatrix sex on the other. Where would you put homosexuality? And we were gobsmacked. You know, it's like, this is not about sex. This is about people.
Yeah.
You know? So when we come across those kinds of things, you know, we are certainly not quiet in educating people as to, you know, and I'm amazed at the level of ignorance about this. And the more people know somebody who is gay, the easier it becomes for them to say, oh, well, yeah, I know that person. No, great person. You know, so that, I think, is really why people like us really need to stand up.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.